The night sky over Los Angeles exploded at 25 minutes past 2 on the morning of February 25, 1942. Searchlights sliced through the darkness like enormous white fingers, crisscrossing frantically above the sleeping city. Then came the guns. Anti-aircraft batteries positioned along the coast erupted in a thunderous barrage that would continue for nearly 6 hours. Over 1,400 shells screamed into the night sky, their detonations painting the clouds in bursts of orange and white. Tracer rounds arced upward in glowing ribbons of red and green, illuminating something, or perhaps nothing, hovering in the darkness above America's second-largest city. Just weeks earlier, the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor. The West Coast lived in paralyzing fear that they would be next. Families had taped their windows against bomb blasts. Blackout curtains hung in every home. Civil defense wardens patrolled neighborhoods, enforcing light discipline with an urgency that bordered on panic. The nation was at war, and Los Angeles stood exposed on the Pacific Rim, vulnerable and terrified. What exactly triggered that massive military response remains one of World War II's most enduring mysteries. What hung in the sky that night, caught in those desperate searchlight beams that convinced battle-hardened commanders to unleash such devastating firepower over their own city? The official explanations would shift and contradict. The evidence would disappear. The witnesses would disagree. And the questions would persist for generations, unanswered and unsettling. This is the story of the Battle of Los Angeles, and nothing about it makes sense. The sun had barely risen over the Pacific on the morning of December 7, 1941, when the first wave of Japanese aircraft appeared over the Hawaiian Islands like a deadly swarm. For 2 hours, 353 Imperial Japanese Navy aircraft systematically dismantled America's sense of invincibility. When the smoke finally cleared over Pearl Harbor, more than 2,400 Americans lay dead, another 1,000 wounded, and the Pacific Fleet's battleship row had been transformed into a graveyard of twisted metal and burning oil. The Arizona alone entombed over 1,000 sailors in her hull, a mass grave that still weeps oil into the harbor waters to this day. But the true devastation extended far beyond the physical destruction of ships and aircraft. Something fundamental had broken in the American psyche that morning, a wound that would bleed fear and suspicion across the entire West Coast for months to come. 86 days later, that fear had metastasized into something approaching collective madness. The Pacific coastline, stretching from the Canadian border down through California to Mexico, had become a landscape of paranoia. Families huddled in darkened homes each night, windows covered with blackout curtains so thick that not even a sliver of light could escape to guide enemy bombers to their targets. Children learned to recognize the wail of air raid sirens before they could recite the alphabet. Mothers clutched their infants tighter whenever aircraft engines rumbled overhead, never entirely certain whether those engines belonged to American patrol planes or Japanese bombers, beginning the invasion that everyone knew must be coming. The military installations that dotted the California coast operated on a knife's edge of readiness. Anti-aircraft batteries sprouted from hillsides like deadly mushrooms, their barrels perpetually pointed skyward, crews manning them around the clock in rotating shifts that left young soldiers exhausted and jumpy. The men who operated these weapons had seen the photographs from Pearl Harbor, had heard the stories from survivors who described the sky turning black with enemy aircraft. They understood with absolute certainty that they were the last line of defense, that if they failed, if they hesitated even for a moment, American cities would burn just as Pearl Harbor had burned. This was not abstract fear. This was not the paranoia of isolated communities whipped into frenzy by sensationalist newspapers. The danger was real, immediate, and had already struck American soil multiple times. Japanese submarines prowled the Pacific waters just beyond the continental shelf, close enough that their commanders could study the California coastline through periscopes, counting the lights of cities, mapping the locations of military installations, selecting targets for the devastation they would soon unleash. On February 23, 1942, just 2 days before the events that would become known as the Battle of Los Angeles, the war came directly to California in a way that transformed abstract fear into visceral terror. The I-17, a Japanese submarine under the command of Kozo Nishino, surfaced in the dark waters off the coast near Santa Barbara. It was early evening, and most Americans along that stretch of coast were sitting down to dinner, perhaps listening to radio programs, trying to maintain some semblance of normal life despite the war that had consumed their world. The submarine's deck gun crew worked quickly and efficiently, having drilled for this moment countless times during their Pacific crossing. They loaded shell after shell, aimed at the Elwood oil refinery that sprawled across the coastal hills, its storage tanks gleaming in the fading light. The shelling began at 7:16 in the evening. For 20 minutes, the I-17 pumped approximately 25 5.5-inch shells toward the American mainland. The explosions lit up the winter sky, each detonation sending shockwaves through the nearby communities. While the actual physical damage proved relatively minimal, with only a pump house, a derrick, and a catwalk suffering direct hits, the psychological impact was devastating. This was not Pearl Harbor, thousands of miles away in the exotic Pacific. This was California. This was the American mainland. Japanese were not just capable of attacking the United States, they were actively doing so, lobbing explosive shells at American industrial targets, while families cowered in their homes less than a mile away. Witnesses who lived through that evening never forgot the sound of the explosions echoing across the coastal hills, the way the ground trembled beneath their feet, the acrid smell of explosive residue drifting on the ocean breeze. Parents grabbed their children and fled inland, cramming possessions into automobiles, certain that this bombardment was merely the opening salvo of a full-scale invasion. If Japanese submarines could surface with impunity and shell American targets, what would prevent them from landing troops on California beaches? What would stop enemy soldiers from marching into Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle? The military's response to the Elwood shelling only amplified the sense of crisis. Fighter aircraft scrambled from nearby airfields, their pilots scanning the darkening ocean for targets that had already submerged and disappeared into the depths. Anti-aircraft crews went on highest alert, authorized to fire at anything suspicious. No questions asked, no hesitation permitted. The standing orders were clear and unambiguous. Better to shoot at shadows than to allow a second Pearl Harbor. Reports of enemy aircraft sightings flooded into military command centers across the West Coast. Civilians called in hundreds of observations each night, describing formations of unidentified planes, mysterious lights moving across the sky, the unmistakable sound of foreign engines that seemed different somehow from American aircraft. Most of these reports were false alarms, the products of frightened imaginations, seeing threats in every distant airplane, every unusual cloud formation, every odd reflection of moonlight. But the military could not afford to dismiss any report, no matter how unlikely. Pearl Harbor had taught them that the impossible could become reality in the span of a single morning. The atmosphere in Los Angeles during late February 1942 can scarcely be imagined by those who have never lived under the shadow of imminent invasion. The city had transformed into something approaching a military state. Air raid wardens patrolled neighborhoods each night, ensuring compliance with blackout regulations, shouting at anyone careless enough to allow light to escape from their homes. These volunteers took their duties with deadly seriousness, understanding that a single illuminated window could guide enemy bombers to residential neighborhoods. People who violated blackout regulations faced arrest, fines, and the scorn of their neighbors who saw such carelessness as treasonous. The city conducted air raid drills with increasing frequency, the sirens sending millions of people scrambling for shelter in basements, under staircases, anywhere that might offer protection from falling bombs. Schools taught children to dive under their desks at the first sign of danger, a ritual that would continue through different wars and different threats for generations to come. The youngest students, those too young to fully comprehend the larger war, nonetheless absorbed the ambient terror of adults around them, learning to associate the sound of aircraft engines with danger and death. Defense industry workers, employed in the rapidly expanding aircraft factories and shipyards that now operated around the clock, knew that their workplaces made them primary targets. The Japanese military leadership understood that destroying American industrial capacity was just as important as sinking American ships. The massive factories producing B-17 bombers and P-38 fighters in the Los Angeles area represented crucial strategic targets. If enemy bombers could destroy these facilities, they could cripple America's ability to project air power across the Pacific. Workers arrived for their shifts, wondering if this would be the night when bombs began falling, when the factory floor would erupt in flames and destruction. Military commanders faced an impossible situation. They operated with incomplete intelligence about enemy capabilities and intentions. They knew Japanese submarines were actively operating off the California coast. They knew that Japan possessed aircraft carriers capable of launching devastating airstrikes, as Pearl Harbor had proven so horrifically. They did not know where those carriers were at any given moment. They did not know when the next attack would come. They only knew with absolute certainty that another attack was coming, that it was not a question of if but when. This climate of fear and uncertainty, this toxic mixture of real threats and imagined dangers, created the perfect conditions for catastrophe. When military commanders received reports of unidentified aircraft approaching Los Angeles in the early morning hours of February 25th, just 2 days after the Elwood shelling, they faced a split-second decision with potentially millions of lives hanging in the balance. They could assume the reports were false, another phantom sighting by nervous observers seeing threats that did not exist. Or they could assume the worst, that this was the invasion everyone had been dreading, that Japanese bombers were indeed approaching to rain destruction upon American cities. The young men manning anti-aircraft batteries across the Los Angeles basin had been living on the edge of exhaustion and terror for weeks. They had heard the reports from Elwood. They understood that the enemy was real, close, and willing to attack. When the order finally came to open fire, when they were finally permitted to do something, anything, to strike back against the fear that had been consuming them, they unleashed everything they had into the dark sky above Los Angeles. What happened next would become one of the most controversial and mysterious events in American military history. A night when thousands of rounds of anti-aircraft ammunition exploded over a major American city, and nobody could agree on what, if anything, they had been shooting at. The night of February 24, 1942, began like any other in wartime Los Angeles. Families slept fitfully in their beds, blackout curtains drawn tight against their windows. The city remained on edge, still reeling from the shock of Pearl Harbor just 11 weeks earlier. The Japanese attack had transformed the West Coast from a peaceful haven into the front lines of a war that suddenly felt terrifyingly close. Military installations dotted the coastline, anti-aircraft batteries positioned on hilltops and rooftops throughout the metropolitan area, their crews maintaining constant vigilance against an enemy that could materialize from the darkness at any moment. At precisely 2:25 in the morning, that darkness was shattered. The first indication of something wrong came from the radar installations monitoring the approaches to Los Angeles. Operators stared at their screens in disbelief as a contact appeared 120 miles west of the city, moving steadily inland from the Pacific Ocean. In the tense atmosphere of early 1942, with invasion fears running high and nerves stretched to the breaking point, this could only mean one thing. The Japanese were coming. The attack everyone had feared, the nightmare scenario military planners had discussed in hushed tones, was finally happening. Los Angeles was about to experience what Pearl Harbor had endured, what Manila had suffered, what every coastal city in America dreaded with mounting terror. The air raid sirens erupted across the city within minutes. Their wailing cry tore through the quiet neighborhoods, shocking residents from their sleep and sending them stumbling toward their windows, toward their doors, trying to understand what was happening. The sound was primal, designed to trigger immediate fear and response. In living rooms and bedrooms across Los Angeles, people froze, listening to that terrible sound and knowing exactly what it meant. The war had arrived on American soil. Military installations throughout the region burst into frantic activity. At Fort MacArthur, soldiers who had been dozing at their posts snapped to attention. Gun crews scrambled toward their weapons, pulling on helmets and gear as they ran. Officers barked orders, coordinating with other batteries spread across the city, establishing firing patterns and elevation angles. The 37th Coast Artillery Brigade, responsible for defending the Los Angeles basin, mobilized every available weapon. 12.5-pound anti-aircraft shells were loaded into breeches, the metallic clang of ammunition echoing across the darkness. Throughout the city, residents responded to the air raid with a mixture of terror and trained obedience. For months, civil defense authorities had conducted drills, teaching civilians how to respond to exactly this scenario. Now the training was put to the test. Lights winked out across Los Angeles, block by block, neighborhood by neighborhood, until the entire metropolitan area vanished into absolute darkness. A city of more than 1.5 million people simply disappeared, as if someone had thrown a switch and erased it from existence. Street lamps went dark. Neon signs were extinguished. Even the glow from cigarettes was forbidden. Air raid wardens patrolled the streets, shouting at anyone who showed even a sliver of light, threats and fines ready for those who might give enemy bombers a target. The blackout transformed Los Angeles into an alien landscape. Those few people brave enough or foolish enough to venture onto their porches or into their yards found themselves in a darkness more complete than most city dwellers had ever experienced. The urban glow that normally bathed everything in ambient light had vanished entirely. Stars became visible overhead, thousands of them, a sight many Los Angeles residents had never actually seen from their own backyards. But nobody was stargazing that night. Every eye turned westward, toward the ocean, toward the threat approaching from the darkness. Then the searchlights ignited. Massive carbon arc searchlights positioned throughout the city flared to life, their brilliant beams stabbing upward into the night sky. These were not ordinary light. Each searchlight generated 800 million candle power, capable of illuminating aircraft at altitudes exceeding 30,000 feet. The beams swept back and forth across the darkness, searching, probing, looking for the enemy that radar had detected. Witnesses described the effect as otherworldly, these pillars of pure light moving through the blackness, like the fingers of giants reaching up from Earth to touch the heavens. The searchlights began to converge. One beam had found something. Then another swung to join it. Then another. Within moments, dozens of searchlights from batteries scattered across the Los Angeles basin focused on a single point in the sky. The beams created a cone of light so intense that people 20 miles away could see it clearly. Whatever the searchlights had captured hung there in the intersection of all those beams, suspended in the sky over the darkened city. And that's when witnesses began to see something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. At 3:16 in the morning, the 37th Coast Artillery Brigade opened fire. The sound was apocalyptic. Anti-aircraft guns erupted simultaneously from positions throughout the city, their muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness in staccato bursts of orange and yellow flame. The concussive force of the barrage rattled windows for miles. Residents cowering in their homes felt the vibrations through the floors, through the walls, through their very bones. The sky above Los Angeles exploded into a chaos of tracer fire and bursting shells. 12.5-pound projectiles screamed upward, their fuses set to detonate at specific altitudes, filling the air with deadly shrapnel. The barrage continued without pause. Gun crews loaded and fired as fast as humanly possible, their movements mechanical, their training taking over. Shell casings piled up around the gun emplacements. The smell of cordite filled the air, acrid and choking. Officers shouted coordinates and corrections, trying to track whatever was moving through the searchlight beams. The city that had been utterly silent, just minutes before now, thundered with the sound of modern warfare, a sound most residents had only heard in newsreels from distant battlefields. Now it was here, directly overhead, impossible to ignore or deny. And through it all, the object continued moving slowly through the sky, seemingly unaffected by the intense anti-aircraft fire. Witness testimonies from that night described something that defied easy explanation. Mrs. Hui, Katie Ryan, standing in her backyard in Culver City, watched the searchlights converge on what she described as a massive object, completely round, moving with deliberate slowness from west to east across the city. She insisted it made no sound, produced no exhaust or smoke, and seemed entirely unbothered by the shells exploding all around it. The anti-aircraft fire appeared to pass through it, or bounce off without effect, the bursting charges creating spectacular patterns of light that only made the object more visible. C.J. Morgan, an air raid warden in Long Beach, provided sworn testimony that he observed 3 distinct craft moving in formation. He described them as enormous, larger than any aircraft he had ever seen, silvery or luminous in the searchlight beams. They moved with what he called impossible slowness, hanging in the air in a way that violated everything he understood about aircraft and aerodynamics. When the anti-aircraft fire intensified around these objects, they simply continued their course, undeviating and apparently invulnerable. A defense worker named Peter Jenkins, stationed at a manufacturing plant in Santa Monica, had a clear view of the entire event from his elevated position. He described seeing an object so large that he initially thought it must be some kind of strange cloud formation caught in the searchlights. But clouds don't maintain perfect geometric shapes, and clouds don't move with such deliberate, controlled motion. He watched shells explode directly around the object, creating brilliant bursts of light, but the thing continued forward, unscathed and unconcerned. The anti-aircraft barrage continued for hours. Gun crews fired more than 1,400 rounds into the sky that night, expending vast quantities of ammunition in a sustained effort to bring down whatever was traversing the Los Angeles basin. The city remained in complete blackout. Residents huddled in their homes, listening to the guns thunder above them, watching through cracks in their blackout curtains as the sky lit up with tracer fire and exploding shells. Children cried. Adults prayed. Everyone waited for the bombs to fall, for the destruction they all knew must be coming. But no bombs fell. No attack materialized. The mysterious objects simply continued their slow procession across the city and eventually vanished, leaving behind only questions and the acrid smell of gunpowder hanging in the pre-dawn air. When the all-clear finally sounded, just before 4:30 in the morning, Los Angeles emerged from its blackout into chaos. The streets filled with confused and frightened residents demanding to know what had happened. Had there been an attack? Had enemy aircraft been shot down? Why had no bombs been dropped? Military authorities offered no immediate answers, scrambling to understand the night's events themselves. Reports flooded in from across the city, each adding to a picture that made less sense the more details that emerged. The question that haunted everyone, the question that would never be satisfactorily answered, was simple and terrifying. What had they been shooting at? Military logs confirmed the radar contact, confirmed the visual sightings by trained observers, confirmed that something had triggered the most intensive anti-aircraft barrage ever fired in the continental United States. But what was it? Where had it come from? And most disturbing of all, why had thousands of rounds of anti-aircraft fire failed to bring down even a single object? The first shells began their ascent at 3:14 in the morning, tearing through the blackness above Los Angeles with a sound that seemed to split the very fabric of the night. What started as a measured defensive response would, over the next hour, transform into one of the most intense sustained barrages ever unleashed over an American city. The gunners had their orders, their targets illuminated in the crisscrossing beams of dozens of searchlights, and they would not stop firing until dawn broke over the Pacific, or until every shell in their magazines had been spent. Within the first 10 minutes, 37 separate gun batteries scattered across Los Angeles County opened fire in near synchronization. The 12.8-inch guns of the 37th Coast Artillery Brigade roared to life from positions in Inglewood, their massive shells screaming skyward at velocities that made the air itself seem to tear. Batteries positioned along the coastline from Long Beach to Santa Monica joined the chorus, their muzzle flashes creating a strobe light effect that painted the undersides of the low-hanging clouds in shades of orange and yellow. The 3-inch anti-aircraft guns added their sharper, more rapid reports to the symphony of destruction, firing at a rate that would consume their ammunition stores with alarming speed. The noise was unlike anything the city had ever experienced. Veterans of the Great War, men who had survived the artillery barrages of the Western Front, would later tell reporters that the sustained fire over Los Angeles that night rivaled anything they had endured in the trenches of France. The continuous roar was not merely heard but felt, a physical presence that pressed against eardrums and vibrated through bone and tissue. In neighborhoods directly beneath the aerial battle, the concussive force of the explosions rattled dishes from shelves, cracked plaster walls, and sent family portraits tumbling from mantelpieces. Windows began to shatter almost immediately. The first to go were those closest to the gun emplacements, blown inward by the repeated shockwaves of the massive coastal defense guns. But as the barrage intensified and spread across a wider arc of the sky, windows throughout central Los Angeles began to fail. In downtown high-rises, entire walls of glass fractured in cascading sequences, the breaking panes creating their own percussive accompaniment to the artillery fire. Homeowners who had carefully taped their windows in preparation for possible air raids watched helplessly as the precaution proved insufficient against the intensity of their own military's defensive fire. The searchlight operators strained at their posts, following objects that seemed to defy the laws of physics and common sense. From Battery D in Inglewood, Corporal James Hendricks reported maintaining illumination on a large object moving at what he estimated to be no more than 10 miles per hour across the southwestern sky. His beam held steady on the target as gunners below adjusted their aim and fired salvo after salvo directly into the cone of light. Hendricks would later swear in official reports that he watched shells explode against the object, brilliant orange flowers of flame blossoming around its perimeter. Yet it continued on its leisurely path without deviation or any sign of damage. 3 miles to the east, another searchlight crew told an entirely different story. Technical Sergeant Walter Barnes and his team tracked multiple smaller objects, perhaps 5 or 6, moving in formation at considerably higher speed. These targets, whatever they were, seemed to execute coordinated maneuvers, rising and falling in the sky with purpose and intelligence. Barnes directed his beam to follow them as they wove between the shell bursts, appearing to dodge the incoming fire with impossible precision. His frustration mounted as he watched his assigned gun crews fire pattern after pattern, always seemingly one step behind the moving targets. Yet, in other parts of the city, spotters saw nothing at all. Lieutenant Kenneth Rogers, positioned at a key observation post in the Hollywood Hills with an unobstructed view of the entire aerial display, reported only empty sky, punctuated by the bursting shells. Through his high-powered binoculars, he could see the searchlight beams clearly enough, watch them sweep, and focus on apparent targets. But where the light converged, he saw only smoke and the lingering glow of explosions. He radioed his observations repeatedly to command, his reports adding another layer of confusion to an already chaotic situation. How could gun crews 3 miles apart be reporting direct hits on solid objects, while observers with optical equipment saw nothing but air? The rate of fire accelerated as the night wore on. Ammunition handlers worked in desperate relay chains, hauling shells from storage bunkers to the hungry guns. The crews fell into mechanical rhythms, the loaders and gunners moving in practiced synchronization, even as their ears rang, and their shoulders ached from the relentless recoil. By 3:45, more than 800 shells had been fired. By 4 in the morning, that number exceeded 1,000. The final accounting, tallied in the cold light of the following day, would record over 1,400 rounds of anti-aircraft ammunition expended during the engagement. On the ground, the civilian population endured their own desperate battle. In the absolute darkness of the mandated blackout, the city had become a maze of invisible hazard. Cars collided at intersections where traffic signals had been switched off, their drivers unable to see beyond the reach of their heavily masked headlights. On South Figueroa Street, a delivery truck struck a fire hydrant, sending a geyser of water into the air that added to the surreal atmosphere of the night. At the intersection of Wilshire and Western, 2 vehicles crashed head-on, their drivers blinded by a particularly bright shell burst directly overhead. Dozens of minor accidents occurred throughout the city as residents fled their homes in panic or attempted to drive to safety through streets they could barely navigate. But the falling shrapnel posed a far deadlier threat than traffic accidents. What goes up must come down, and 1,400 shells worth of steel fragments were raining back onto the city below. The spent shell casings, jagged pieces of shattered ordnance, and unexploded fuse mechanisms fell like deadly hail across a wide swath of Los Angeles County. On East 21st Street, a chunk of shrapnel weighing nearly 3 pounds crashed through the roof of the Larson family home, punching through the ceiling of the bedroom where moments before the family had been sleeping. They had taken shelter in their basement at the first sound of the air raid sirens, a decision that almost certainly saved their lives. Others were not so fortunate. In Long Beach, 52-year-old Emma Nightingale was struck by falling shrapnel as she stood on her front porch, watching the spectacular and terrible display in the sky above. The piece of metal, later determined to be part of a shell casing from a 3-inch gun, caught her in the upper chest. She died before the ambulance could navigate the blacked-out streets to reach her. In Inglewood, another civilian fell victim to the debris, killed instantly when a larger fragment penetrated the roof of his garage, where he had been attempting to protect his automobile from potential bomb damage. 3 more civilians died from indirect hits, struck by shrapnel fragments as they moved through the streets. One was an air raid warden, killed while performing his duty to enforce the blackout and direct civilians to shelters. The irony was not lost on his fellow wardens, who had to continue their duties even as they processed the death of their colleague. By the time the all-clear sounded, 5 people lay dead from the falling metal, their bodies testament to the deadly mathematics of sustained anti-aircraft fire over a populated city. The hospitals began to fill with the injured. Dozens arrived with cuts from flying glass, some superficial and some severe enough to require immediate surgery. Others had been struck by smaller fragments of shrapnel, the metal embedded in limbs and torsos. The emergency rooms of Los Angeles County General Hospital, California Hospital, and Good Samaritan Hospital worked through the night, their staffs operating by emergency lighting as they triaged and treated a steady stream of casualties from a battle that was supposed to be protecting them. 3 additional deaths occurred that night, though no metal touched these victims. The sheer terror of the sustained bombardment proved too much for hearts already weakened by age and stress. In separate locations across the city, 3 people suffered fatal heart attacks as the barrage thundered overhead. One was a 73-year-old man who collapsed in his hallway as he attempted to reach his basement shelter. Another was a woman in her late 60s who died while huddled with her family in their bathroom, the perceived safest room in their home. The third was a middle-aged man with a history of cardiac problems who succumbed to the stress as he watched the sky light up with explosions from his backyard, unable to tear himself away from the spectacle, despite his family's pleas to take cover. Inside the various command posts, confusion reigned as completely as the fire ruled the sky. Reports flooded in from observers and gun crews, but they contradicted each other in fundamental ways. Some crews reported solid hits, describing the satisfying sight of their shells detonating directly against visible targets. Other crews reported their shells seemed to pass through the objects without effect, exploding in empty air beyond them. Searchlight operators reported objects moving at speeds ranging from walking pace to several hundred miles per hour. Some reported single large craft, others reported formations of smaller objects, and still others reported seeing nothing at all, despite being directed to specific coordinates, where other observers insisted targets were clearly visible. The altitude estimates varied just as wildly. Some observers placed the objects at 5,000 feet, well within the effective range of the lighter anti-aircraft guns. Others insisted the targets were at 15,000 feet or higher, requiring the maximum elevation and charge from the larger coastal guns. This discrepancy in perceived altitude alone could account for some of the reported misses, as gunners calculated their fire solutions based on dramatically different assumptions about target distance. As the barrage entered its second hour, the intensity began to waver. Some batteries reported critically low ammunition supplies. Crews that had been firing at maximum rate were exhausted, their movements becoming slower and less precise. The continuous noise had rendered some gunners effectively deaf, communicating only through hand signals and written notes. Yet still the firing continued, driven by the conviction that something was out there, that the searchlights were not tracking phantoms, that the threat was real and had to be met with overwhelming force. Finally, at 4:14 in the morning, exactly 1 hour after the first shells had been fired, the order came down to cease fire. The sudden silence was almost as shocking as the initial roar had been. Ears continued to ring in the absence of sound. The last echoes of the final explosions rolled away across the basin, fading into the pre-dawn darkness. The searchlights continued to sweep for several minutes more, probing the sky for targets that seemed to have vanished as completely as they had appeared. As dawn approached and the blackout order was lifted, Los Angeles began to assess the damage from the night's engagement. The civilian casualties were counted, the injured were treated, and the thousands of broken windows were documented. Shell fragments littered streets and yards, collected by curious residents as grim souvenirs of the night their city had gone to war against the sky. The official reports would take days to compile, and when they were finished, they would raise more questions than they answered. What had been out there? Had anything been out there at all? And if something had indeed invaded the airspace over Los Angeles that night, where it had gone, and why had over 1,400 shells failed to bring it down? In the pre-dawn hours of February 25, 1942, as Los Angeles trembled under the cacophony of anti-aircraft fire, and the city's searchlights swept frantically across the smoke-filled sky, One photographer named Frank Warren stood on the roof of the Los Angeles Times building, his hands steady despite the chaos erupting around him. He had covered fires, earthquakes, and crime scenes throughout his career, but nothing had prepared him for what he was about to capture. As shells exploded overhead and the concussive blasts rattled windows throughout downtown, Warren adjusted his large format camera, set for a time exposure that would gather enough light to record whatever the searchlights revealed. The exposure lasted several seconds, and in that brief window, Warren immortalized what would become one of the most scrutinized photographs in the history of unidentified aerial phenomena. When the image was developed later that morning, it showed something that defied easy categorization. Multiple searchlight beams converged on a single point in the sky, their brilliant white columns forming a luminous cone that trapped something at its apex. The object appeared to glow, surrounded by what the military would later claim were exploding anti-aircraft shells, creating a halo effect. But the photograph suggested something more concrete, more structured than mere shell bursts and smoke. Enhanced versions of the image, examined decades later with modern photographic analysis techniques, seemed to reveal a disc-shaped object, solid and self-luminous, caught in the intersection of those powerful beams. The photograph ran on the front page of the Los Angeles Times that very morning, above the fold, with the headline describing the previous night's battle over Los Angeles. Thousands of residents saw it over their morning coffee, their hands still trembling from a sleepless night spent in shelters or watching the sky erupt with fire. The image seemed to validate what they had witnessed with their own eyes, the object or objects that had prompted the military to unleash over 1,400 rounds of anti-aircraft ammunition over the city. Here was proof, or so it appeared, that something had been up there, something substantial enough to reflect searchlight beams and warrant such an overwhelming response. But almost immediately, the official explanation began to diverge from what the photograph appeared to show. The military's initial statement claimed that as many as 15 aircraft, possibly of enemy origin, had been detected over Los Angeles. Then the story shifted. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox held a press conference where he dismissed the entire incident as a false alarm, suggesting jittery nerves and war hysteria had caused anti-aircraft crews to fire at nothing. But if they had fired at nothing, what was captured in Warren's photograph? What had all those searchlights focused upon with such precision? The Army contradicted the Navy's assessment within days, insisting that unidentified aircraft had indeed been present over Los Angeles, though they stopped short of confirming they were enemy planes. This official discord only deepened the mystery surrounding the photograph. Residents who had watched the spectacle unfold remembered seeing a distinct object moving slowly across the sky, impervious to the shells bursting around it. The photograph seemed to corroborate their memories, yet the authorities offered explanations that ranged from weather balloons to mass hallucination to an elaborate training exercise gone awry. Warren himself remained largely silent about what he had photographed, at least publicly. But according to colleagues who worked with him at the Times, he confided that the object in his photograph was unlike anything he had expected to capture. He described the way the searchlights had locked onto it, how they moved in coordinated sweeps, as if tracking something with intention and purpose. Other photographers who were positioned at various locations around Los Angeles that night captured similar images, though none achieved the clarity and composition of Warren's shot. These additional photographs, many of which were never published or have since been lost, reportedly showed the same convergence of searchlights on what appeared to be a solid object. The tension between what the photograph shows and what officials claimed it shows has only intensified over the decades. In the 1960s, when researchers began applying photographic enhancement techniques to the original image, new details emerged. The object at the center of the searchlight cone appeared to have defined edges, a symmetrical shape that some analysts described as disc-like or oval. The shell bursts, visible in the photograph as bright splotches around the central object, did not appear to be hitting anything. Instead, they seemed to detonate at a distance from the luminous center, as if unable to reach the target or programmed to explode at a predetermined altitude. Photographic experts who examined the image in subsequent years noted peculiarities that challenged both the official explanation and some of the alternative theories. If the photograph merely captured shell bursts and searchlight beams reflecting off smoke or clouds, the central object should not appear as distinct and defined as it does. Smoke and clouds disperse light in ways that create fuzzy, indistinct glows. But the object in Warren's photograph maintains structural integrity, its edges crisp enough to suggest something solid catching and reflecting the searchlight beams. On the other hand, if the object were a conventional aircraft, the photo should show some evidence of wings, tail assembly, or other recognizable features. Instead, the enhanced images reveal a shape that defies conventional aircraft design of that era. Several journalists who covered the story in 1942 later spoke of pressure from military censors to downplay what they had witnessed. One reporter, who requested anonymity when interviewed in the 1970s, described watching the object from the roof of a building near City Hall. He said it moved with a deliberate slowness, seemingly unaffected by the explosive shells detonating around it. When he submitted his story describing a solid disc-shaped craft, his editor killed the piece and ran a sanitized version that focused on the anti-aircraft response, without speculating on what prompted it. The reporter claimed he was visited by military intelligence officers who strongly suggested that he had been mistaken about what he saw, that the chaos and darkness had distorted his perception. This pattern repeated across multiple newsrooms in Los Angeles during the days following the incident. Witnesses among the press corps described seeing one thing but being told to report another. The gap between visual evidence and official narrative became a chasm that has never been adequately bridged. The photograph stands as a kind of Rorschach test, revealing as much about what observers want to believe as it does about what actually occurred that night. Skeptics point to it as evidence of wartime hysteria captured on film, the convergence of searchlights on nothing more substantial than atmospheric conditions and imagination. Believers see unmistakable proof of a structured craft, possibly of non-human origin, caught in a web of light above a panicked city. What makes Warren's photograph so compelling is its ambiguity married to its specificity. Unlike blurry snapshots or distant lights that characterize many photographs of unidentified objects, this image shows a defined event captured with professional equipment by a trained photographer. The searchlights provide scale and context. The shell bursts mark the military's conviction that something warranted such aggressive response. Yet, the central object remains tantalizingly unclear, distinct enough to provoke analysis, but ambiguous enough to resist definitive interpretation. Modern digital enhancement of the photograph has yielded mixed results. Some analysts claim they can discern a classic flying saucer shape, complete with a dome structure on top. Others argue that such details emerge from the enhancement process itself, artifacts created by amplifying grain and contrast rather than revealing hidden structures. The debate circles back endlessly to the same fundamental questions. What did the searchlights illuminate that night, and why does the official explanation seem so inadequate when measured against the visual evidence? The photograph has appeared in countless books, documentaries, and articles exploring the Los Angeles air raid and the broader phenomenon of unidentified aerial objects. It has been analyzed by everyone from serious academic researchers to conspiracy theorists, each finding in it confirmation of their existing beliefs. But perhaps the most telling aspect of Warren's photograph is what it reveals about the nature of evidence itself. Here is a clear image, captured under extraordinary circumstances, published in a major newspaper, yet it has failed to settle any question definitively. Instead, it has spawned decades of argument, interpretation, and counter-interpretation. Those few surviving witnesses who were present that night and saw the photograph when it was first published often express frustration at how the image has been used and misused over the years. They remember the terror of that night, the absolute conviction that Los Angeles was under attack, the sight of that object hanging in the sky as shells burst around it. The photograph captured a moment of that experience, but no single image could convey the full sensory reality of watching something inexplicable hover above your city, while the military threw everything it had at an enemy it could not seem to touch. The gap between what they experienced and what any photograph could capture is itself a kind of evidence, testimony to the limits of documentation when confronting the truly anomalous. Today, the original negative of Warren's photograph resides in the Los Angeles Times archives, a fragile piece of film that holds more questions than answers. Each generation brings new technology to bear on its analysis, hoping to finally resolve what the image shows. But perhaps the photograph's greatest significance lies not in what it definitively proves or disproves, but in how it captures a moment when the official story and the visual record diverged so dramatically that the gap between them has never been closed. In that convergence of searchlights on something that remains unidentified nearly 80 years later, we see crystallized all the ambiguity and wonder that surrounds humanity's encounters with the unexplained. The morning sun rose over Los Angeles on February 25, 1942, casting light on a city that had barely survived the night. Thousands of residents emerged from shelters and basements, their ears still ringing from the barrage, their eyes scanning the skies for wreckage that should have been everywhere. After firing 1,400 rounds of anti-aircraft ammunition into the darkness, after searchlights had illuminated unidentified objects for hours, after the most sustained military action on American soil since the Civil War, the citizens of Southern California deserved answers. What they received instead would transform a military incident into one of the most confounding mysteries in American history. The confusion began almost immediately. As dawn broke and the smoke cleared, something became disturbingly apparent. There was no wreckage. Not a single piece of twisted metal, not one fragment of a downed aircraft, not a scrap of evidence that anything at all had been hit by the massive wall of explosive shells fired into the Los Angeles sky. The streets, which should have been littered with debris, were pristine except for the spent shell casings from American guns. Fire departments, which had prepared for crashed aircraft and burning buildings from falling ordnance, found themselves dealing only with damage from American shells that had fallen back to Earth unexploded. Reporters descended on military officials, demanding explanation. The public, exhausted and frightened, waited for clarity. What had they fired at? What had threatened their city? Had enemy aircraft really penetrated American airspace, and if so, where had they gone? The first official statement came swiftly, and it was stunning in its dismissiveness. Navy Secretary Frank Knox, speaking from Washington just hours after the incident, held a press conference that would ignite a firestorm of controversy. His words were clear, unambiguous, and absolute. The entire event, he declared, was a false alarm. There had been no aircraft over Los Angeles. Not one. Not enemy planes, not friendly planes, not anything at all. The searchlights had illuminated nothing but empty sky. The anti-aircraft batteries had fired at phantom targets. The whole terrifying episode, according to the highest naval authority, had been triggered by nothing more than war nerves and jittery sentiments among troops, still rattled by the very real submarine attack on the California coast just one day earlier. Knox's statement was delivered with the confidence of a man who believed the matter settled. He suggested that perhaps a weather balloon had been spotted, or maybe the anxious anti-aircraft crews had simply imagined threats where none existed. The implication was clear and slightly condescending. Los Angeles had panicked. The military had overreacted. Nothing had really happened. The citizens could return to their lives, embarrassed perhaps, but safe in the knowledge that no actual threat had materialized. The reaction to Knox's statement was immediate and explosive. Across Los Angeles, witnesses who had watched the searchlights track solid objects across the sky felt insulted and dismissed. Air raid wardens who had observed the entire event from rooftops were bewildered. Military personnel who had manned the guns and fired at visible targets were confused. And then, before the controversy could even fully develop, everything became infinitely more complicated. The United States Army issued its own statement, and it contradicted the Navy completely. According to Army officials, there had absolutely been aircraft over Los Angeles. Not imaginary planes. Not weather balloons. Not mass hallucination. Real, physical aircraft had violated American airspace during the early morning hours of February 25th. The Army's Western Defense Command stated unequivocally that between 1 and 5 unidentified airplanes had been involved in the incident. They had been tracked by multiple observation posts. They had been illuminated by searchlights. They had been fired upon by anti-aircraft batteries. They were real. But the Army's statement, while contradicting the Navy on the fundamental question of whether anything had been present at all, raised even more disturbing questions than it answered. If there had been aircraft, where had they come from? The Army suggested an almost unthinkable possibility. These might have been commercial planes, possibly flown by enemy agents operating from secret bases within the United States or from hidden locations across the Mexican border. The implication was chilling. Enemy operatives might be living among the civilian population, with access to aircraft, conducting psychological warfare operations designed to spread panic and tie up military resources. The conflict between the two military branches was unprecedented and deeply troubling. Here were the Navy and Army, supposedly coordinating the defense of the nation, offering completely contradictory accounts of the same event. One branch insisted nothing had happened. The other insisted something definitely had happened but couldn't explain what or where it had gone. Both were official positions from the United States government, and they could not possibly both be true. Congress reacted with fury and alarm. Representative Leland Ford of California demanded a full investigation, asking pointed questions about the competence of the military command, if 1,400 shells could be fired at nothing, or alternatively if enemy aircraft could penetrate American defenses, fly over a major city for hours, and escape without a trace. Other congressional representatives raised questions about the cost of the ammunition alone, not to mention the danger posed to civilians by unexploded shells falling back to Earth. If nothing had been in the sky, as Secretary Knox claimed, then someone needed to be held accountable for the most expensive false alarm in military history. If something had been in the sky, as the Army insisted, then where was it now? The press seized on the contradictions with relish. Newspaper editorials across the country noted the disturbing implications. Either the military was firing blindly at nothing, wasting resources and endangering civilians, or something had been in the sky over Los Angeles that could withstand or evade 1,400 rounds of anti-aircraft fire and leave no trace of its presence. Neither option was comforting. Some papers suggested a cover-up was underway, though they differed on what was being covered up. Was the military hiding its own incompetence? Or was something stranger being concealed? As investigations proceeded and more information emerged, the contradictions only deepened. Air raid wardens provided detailed logs showing the progression of unidentified objects across the sky, tracked by searchlights moving in coordination. These were not random lights sweeping empty air. They were following something. Artillery crews insisted they had maintained visual contact with targets before firing. They had not simply blasted away at darkness. They had aimed at illuminated objects and watched their shells explode in proximity to those objects without apparent effect. The absence of wreckage became increasingly difficult to explain under any conventional scenario. 1,400 anti-aircraft shells had been fired during a period of sustained engagement. These were not small projectiles. They were designed to destroy aircraft, and the sheer volume of fire made it statistically improbable that every single shell had missed, if there were indeed 1 to 5 aircraft present, as the Army claimed. But if the shells had hit their targets, where was the evidence? Aircraft do not simply vanish when struck by explosive ordnance. They fall. They burn. They leave debris fields. Some military officials suggested that perhaps the unidentified aircraft had been hit, but had managed to limp away and crash elsewhere, possibly into the ocean. Search operations were conducted along the coast, but nothing was found. No oil slicks, no floating debris, no evidence that anything had gone into the water. Other officials proposed that perhaps the aircraft had been flying at extreme altitudes where the anti-aircraft shells couldn't reach them effectively. But this contradicted the eyewitness accounts of objects clearly illuminated by searchlights at what appeared to be relatively low altitude. The theory that commercial planes flown by enemy agents had been responsible created its own problems. Commercial aircraft of the era were slow, noisy, and fragile. They would have been easily identifiable and almost certainly destroyed by the concentrated anti-aircraft fire. Moreover, no commercial aircraft were reported missing. No airports reported suspicious activity. No evidence of a secret enemy base or clandestine airfield was ever discovered despite extensive searches. The logistics of enemy agents acquiring, maintaining, and operating aircraft from hidden locations within the United States or Mexico strained credibility, particularly given the intensity of security and surveillance following the Pearl Harbor attack. As days passed and no satisfactory explanation emerged, public opinion began to fracture along predictable lines. Some accepted Secretary Knox's explanation and dismissed the entire event as a false alarm born of wartime anxiety. These voices pointed to the lack of physical evidence and suggested that mass psychology and poor visibility had created an illusion of threats where none existed. Others trusted the Army's account and believed that enemy aircraft had indeed penetrated American defenses, though they struggled to explain the absence of wreckage or the apparent invulnerability of the targets to anti-aircraft fire. But a third group began to emerge, asking questions that neither official explanation could adequately address. These observers noted that something truly anomalous appeared to have occurred over Los Angeles. Objects visible enough to be tracked by searchlights and targeted by artillery, yet seemingly impervious to explosive shells and capable of disappearing without leaving any physical trace. This didn't match the profile of Japanese aircraft, or any known aircraft for that matter. What had really been in the sky that night? The military's own confusion was perhaps most telling. Internal memos and communications revealed that commanders themselves were uncertain about what had occurred. Some reports described objects that moved in ways inconsistent with conventional aircraft, hovering or changing direction in manners that defied the aerodynamics of 1940s aviation technology. Other reports noted the strange lack of hostile action from whatever had been present. If these were enemy aircraft conducting a raid, why hadn't they dropped bombs? If they were on a reconnaissance mission, why had they remained visible under searchlights for so long, making themselves obvious target? The official conclusion, when it finally came, satisfied almost no one. A joint statement attempted to reconcile the contradictory accounts by suggesting that weather balloons, possibly combined with high-altitude reconnaissance, had created visual effects that were misidentified as aircraft. The anti-aircraft fire, once begun, had created smoke and confusion that perpetuated the misidentification. It was, the statement suggested, an unfortunate combination of poor visibility, wartime stress, and honest mistakes amplified by the fog of war. This explanation raised as many questions as it answered. Weather balloons drift with prevailing winds. They do not maneuver. They certainly do not survive direct hits from anti-aircraft shells and continue operating. The theory failed to account for the detailed observations of multiple trained military personnel who insisted they had tracked solid, moving objects that exhibited characteristics inconsistent with balloons or any known aircraft. The Battle of Los Angeles, as it came to be known, remained officially closed but substantively unresolved. The contradictions in the official record were never adequately reconciled. The mystery of what 1,400 rounds of ammunition had been fired at was never definitively solved. And perhaps most significantly, the incident established a template that would be repeated in countless subsequent cases involving unidentified aerial phenomena. Official denial followed by contradictory, official confirmation. Physical evidence that appears and then vanishes. Explanations that strain credibility more than the original mystery they attempt to resolve. What happened over Los Angeles in the early hours of February 25, 1942, remains one of the most thoroughly witnessed and yet unexplained events in American military history. Something was in the sky that night. Thousands saw it. The military engaged it with sustained fire. But what it was, where it came from, and where it went remain questions without satisfactory answers, buried beneath layers of official contradiction and the disturbing silence of missing evidence. The morning after the Battle of Los Angeles, as workers swept spent shell casings from the streets and residents surveyed shattered windows across the city, the questions began. What exactly had thousands of people witnessed in the early hours of February 25, 1942? The explanations that emerged that day would multiply and evolve over the next 8 decades, each attempting to reconcile eyewitness accounts with military records, physical evidence with wartime paranoia, documented facts with documented contradictions. The first official explanation came swiftly. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox, speaking to reporters just hours after the guns fell silent, dismissed the entire incident as a false alarm triggered by war nerves and anxiety. According to Knox, there had been no aircraft, no enemy attack, no tangible threat whatsoever. The anti-aircraft batteries, he suggested, had fired at phantoms conjured by collective hysteria in a city terrified of Japanese retaliation following Pearl Harbor. This explanation satisfied almost no one. The residents who had watched searchlights track objects across the sky, the military personnel who had radar returns on their screens, the gun crews who had aimed at solid targets all night, knew what they had experienced. The false alarm theory required dismissing thousands of trained observers and sophisticated detection equipment as simultaneously unreliable. Within days, the War Department offered a contradictory assessment. Secretary of War Henry Stimson announced that as many as 15 aircraft had been over Los Angeles that night, likely commercial planes operated by enemy agents seeking to spread panic or conducting reconnaissance missions. This version transformed the event from mass hallucination into genuine enemy action. Stimson's explanation acknowledged the reality of the objects tracked by searchlights and engaged by anti-aircraft fire, but it created new problems. If enemy aircraft had indeed penetrated American airspace and survived sustained bombardment from the coastal defense network, it represented a catastrophic failure of military preparedness. Moreover, no evidence of Japanese aircraft launching from carriers or operating from concealed bases ever materialized. Naval intelligence knew the positions of Japanese carrier groups in the Pacific. None were within range of the California coast on that date. The weather balloon theory emerged as a more sophisticated conventional explanation. Proponents suggested that the Army had released meteorological balloons to test the response capabilities of the coastal defense network and the civilian population. According to this interpretation, military officials had deliberately triggered a false alarm to identify weaknesses in the city's blackout procedures and assess how anti-aircraft crews would respond to aerial intrusion. The sustained firing, the multiple radar contacts, the coordinated searchlight tracking all became part of an elaborate drill that spiraled beyond its intended parameters. This explanation accounts for some aspects of the event, particularly the official confusion and contradictory statements in the following days. If the incident was indeed a test that produced unexpected panic, military and civilian authorities would have strong incentives to obscure the truth. However, the weather balloon theory struggles to explain specific elements of the encounter. Multiple experienced searchlight crews reported tracking objects that maneuvered in response to anti-aircraft fire, accelerating and changing altitude in ways that simple balloons could not. The radar operators logged tracks showing speeds and movement patterns inconsistent with wind-borne objects. Perhaps most significantly, no military personnel involved in the incident ever came forward after the war to confirm it had been a test. The theory requires a cover-up maintained for decades by hundreds of participants. The psychological warfare explanation presents another conventional angle. Some historians suggest the Japanese military did indeed orchestrate the event, not with actual aircraft, but with radio deception and psychological operations designed to spread fear along the West Coast. According to this interpretation, Japanese intelligence had learned enough about American radar systems and coastal defenses to create the impression of an air raid without risking actual aircraft. Radio signals mimicking aircraft transponders, combined with rumors and deliberate disinformation, could have triggered a genuine military response to a phantom threat. This theory accounts for the absence of physical evidence, while acknowledging that something triggered a massive military reaction. Yet it struggles to explain the visual sightings by searchlight crews who reported solid objects, not just radar ghosts. The theory also requires attributing a level of technical sophistication to Japanese psychological operations that historical records don't support. The mass hallucination hypothesis, though quickly dismissed by most serious researchers, periodically resurfaces in skeptical analyses. This explanation suggests that a few legitimate stimuli, perhaps a stray weather balloon or a misidentified aircraft, combined with wartime anxiety and the chaos of anti-aircraft fire to create a shared delusion. The searchlights created the illusion of tracking objects while actually reflecting off clouds and smoke. The radar returns resulted from equipment malfunction or operator error. Thousands of witnesses believed they saw something because they expected to see something in the heightened emotional atmosphere following Pearl Harbor. This interpretation requires accepting that trained military personnel, sophisticated detection equipment, and thousands of civilian observers all simultaneously misperceived reality in remarkably consistent ways. It also fails to account for the physical evidence, including spent ammunition, radar logs, and damage patterns on the ground, consistent with sustained anti-aircraft engagement. Then there is the evidence that resists these conventional explanations. The radar tracking data, preserved in military archives, shows multiple objects moving at various altitudes and speeds throughout the incident. The radar operators were experienced personnel who understood their equipment and could distinguish aircraft from atmospheric phenomena or equipment malfunction. Their logs describe coordinated movements and patterns inconsistent with random targets or technical errors. The searchlight crews, stationed at different locations across the Los Angeles basin, independently tracked objects that appeared to move from one searchlight beam to another, suggesting solid targets rather than illusions created by atmospheric conditions. These crews were trained to distinguish aircraft from balloons, clouds, and other phenomena. Their reports describe objects that held position despite sustained anti-aircraft fire, then accelerated or changed altitude in ways that defied contemporary aircraft capabilities. The anti-aircraft batteries themselves fired over 1,400 rounds of ammunition during the incident. Gun crews aim at targets, not at empty sky. The sustained nature of the firing, continuing for hours, suggests crews were tracking something substantive enough to warrant repeated engagement. Ballistic experts who later analyzed the firing patterns noted that shells were fused for different altitudes throughout the night, indicating gunners were responding to targets at various heights, rather than blindly firing into darkness. The absence of wreckage presents perhaps the most puzzling aspect of the conventional evidence. An object that survived such concentrated fire would need to be either extraordinarily durable or extraordinarily elusive. Contemporary aircraft, whether American or Japanese, would not have survived such sustained anti-aircraft bombardment. No debris was recovered, no crash sites identified, no evidence of damaged aircraft discovered despite extensive searches in the days that followed. The extraterrestrial hypothesis enters this evidentiary vacuum. UFO researchers examining the Battle of Los Angeles note that the characteristics described by witnesses align with patterns reported in other unidentified aerial phenomenon cases. Objects that appear solid to radar and visual observation, but survive sustained military attack. Craft that demonstrate flight characteristics beyond contemporary technology, including rapid acceleration, sustained hovering, and high-speed maneuvers. The complete absence of wreckage despite concentrated fire. These elements, researchers argue, suggest technology not available to any terrestrial military in 1942. The hypothesis gained traction in later decades when similar characteristics appeared in other well-documented UFO incidents involving military witnesses and radar confirmation. Modern UFO researchers point to specific details they find compelling. Witness descriptions of a large central object, estimated at various sizes, but consistently described as substantial, accompanied by smaller objects that moved independently. The way searchlights converged on targets that then appeared to move deliberately, as if aware of the military response. The radar returns showing speeds that would later become characteristic of UFO reports, including sudden accelerations and right-angle turns impossible for conventional aircraft. Some researchers highlight a photograph taken during the incident, published in the Los Angeles Times, showing searchlight beams converging on what appears to be an oval or disc-shaped object. Skeptics contend the photograph shows searchlights illuminating clouds or smoke, but proponents argue the image captures something more structured and defined. The extraterrestrial interpretation also attempts to explain the official confusion and contradictory statements. If military and civilian authorities genuinely did not know what their coastal defenses had engaged, the conflicting explanations make sense as attempts to impose a conventional framework on an unconventional event. The speed with which Secretary Knox dismissed the incident as a false alarm might reflect a desire to prevent public panic rather than a considered analysis of the evidence. Secretary Stinson's later acknowledgement of aircraft over the city might represent a compromised position, acknowledging something occurred while avoiding implications that military officials couldn't identify or stop intruders over a major American city. Skeptical historians offer pointed rebuttals to the extraterrestrial hypothesis. They note that witnesses under stress, observing objects at night through smoke and chaos, make unreliable observers regardless of their training. The human mind seeks patterns and fills gaps in perception with expectation. In February of 1942, Americans expected Japanese attacks and would interpret ambiguous stimuli through that lens. If extraterrestrial craft routinely visited Earth in the 1940s, skeptics ask, why don't we have more definitive evidence? Why would advanced technology capable of interstellar travel reveal itself through random nighttime appearances over cities? The skeptical position argues that the absence of conventional explanation doesn't justify invoking extraordinary causes. The more likely scenario involves some combination of conventional factors, weather phenomena, equipment malfunction, wartime confusion, that created an event that appeared more mysterious than it actually was. The debate continues because the evidence remains genuinely contradictory. Dismissing the incident as mass hallucination requires ignoring radar data and physical evidence. Accepting it as an enemy reconnaissance mission requires believing Japanese aircraft possessed capabilities far beyond documented historical reality. The weather balloon test theory demands accepting a cover-up maintained across decades. The extraterrestrial hypothesis requires accepting the existence of non-human intelligence visiting Earth. Each explanation solves some aspects of the mystery while creating new problems. Contemporary researchers on both sides acknowledge certain facts remain undisputed. Something triggered a massive military response on the night of February 25, 1942. That something was tracked by radar, illuminated by searchlights, and engaged by anti-aircraft batteries for hours. No wreckage was recovered, no definitive identification was ever made, and official explanations contradicted each other from the beginning. Thousands of witnesses observed the incident, many of them trained military personnel operating sophisticated equipment. The event was not a fleeting glimpse or a single witness report, but a sustained encounter documented through multiple independent sources. What happened in the skies over Los Angeles that night remains, 8 decades later, genuinely unresolved. The competing explanations each have adherents and each have weaknesses. The evidence supports multiple interpretations, while definitively proving none. Perhaps that ambiguity itself tells us something important about how we construct explanations for events that challenge our assumptions. The Battle of Los Angeles persists in memory and debate precisely because it resists easy answers, because the evidence points in multiple directions simultaneously, because conventional and unconventional explanations alike require leaps of faith. In that unresolved space between explanation and mystery, between documented fact and persistent question, the incident continues to provoke wonder, skepticism, and endless speculation about what exactly American coastal defenses engaged that night while a city watched the sky burn with light and fury. Let us speak now about what we know to be true and what remains shrouded in darkness. On the 25th of February, 1942, the United States Army fired more than 1,400 shells into the night sky above Los Angeles. This is not speculation. This is documented fact. Shell fragments rained down on homes and streets. Windows shattered. Roofs punctured. 5 people died that night, their bodies counted and recorded. 3 from traffic accidents in the blackout, 2 from heart attacks as the barrage thundered above them. These deaths are real. These casualties have names. Thousands of witnesses watched as searchlight beams converged on objects moving through the darkness. They stood in their yards, on their rooftops, in the streets despite the blackout orders, and they looked up at something illuminated against the night. Photographs captured those searchlights, crossing and recrossing, hunting something in the sky. The Los Angeles Times printed one of those photographs on their front page the next morning. It shows the beams converging, forming a cone of light around a shape that remains unclear even now, decades later. The anti-aircraft guns fired continuously for nearly 6 hours. Gun crews loaded and fired, until their ears bled and their shoulders bruised from the recoil. They were aiming at something. They reported targets. They followed orders to engage. This happened. The noise shook the city. The concussions rattled teeth and bones. And yet, when dawn broke over Los Angeles, no wreckage was found. No debris. No evidence of any aircraft, enemy or otherwise, being hit or destroyed. Nothing fell from the sky except American shells. Search teams found nothing. Recovery crews had nothing to recover. Here is what we do not know, what has never been adequately explained. What were those guns firing at? The initial military reports spoke of enemy aircraft with absolute certainty. Within hours, the Navy contradicted the Army, suggesting the entire event was a false alarm triggered by anxiety and imagination. Then, the explanations shifted again. Weather balloons were mentioned. Mass hysteria was proposed. The stories changed like smoke in wind, never settling, never solidifying into truth. Military documents concerning that night remain partially classified. Even now, more than 8 decades later, portions of the official record are sealed. What could possibly require secrecy after so much time has passed? What details about that night are still considered too sensitive for public knowledge? The classification itself becomes part of the mystery, a locked door that suggests something worth hiding. We stand now in the space between certainty and doubt. We know one of the largest anti-aircraft barrages in American history occurred in defense of a major city. We know it happened, but we do not know why. We do not know what those searchlights illuminated. We do not know what thousands of witnesses saw moving through the darkness above them. Perhaps there are truths that resist all attempts at explanation. Perhaps some events are designed to remain unexplained, forever balanced between what happened and what we can prove happened. The Battle of Los Angeles remains suspended in that liminal space, neither fully solved nor solvable, a wound in the historical record that has never quite healed. Picture those searchlights one final time. See them piercing the darkness, converging on something high above the sleeping city. See the shells bursting like deadly flowers against the night. See the gun crews firing and firing at a target they could barely comprehend. Those lights were searching for something. Those guns were defending against something. And somewhere in that convergence of light and darkness, between what was seen and what could not be explained, the truth remains hidden. Perhaps it was always meant to stay that way. Perhaps we were never supposed to see what those lights revealed. And perhaps that is the most unsettling possibility of all. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.